Miles Corbin was just a single father working the evening shift as a waiter. So when he used sign language with a deaf chief executive, the entire restaurant burst out laughing. The floor manager called him a show-off, his coworkers mocked him for trying to flatter a wealthy guest, and the owner ordered him thrown out of the dining room. But the quiet woman at that table had not come to eat dinner. Evelyn Blackthorne was there to evaluate a business she was about to acquire, and before the night was over, she would choose Miles as her partner. If you enjoy stories of quiet contempt followed by a satisfying reversal, tap subscribe and follow this channel so you never miss how the night ends. Boston woke slowly that morning, the kind of gray autumn light that made every kitchen window look the same. And inside a modest apartment on the western edge of the city, Miles Corbin was already awake before his daughter's alarm went off. He moved through the small kitchen with the practiced quiet of a man who had learned not to wake anyone before he needed to, pouring cereal, packing a lunch, checking the calendar, taped to the refrigerator for the 10th time that week. Nora, 10 years old and sharper than most adults gave her credit for, wandered in already dressed, watching her father with the kind of attention only children give to people they are trying to protect. She noticed the laptop screen still open on the counter, an email from a restaurant group that had rejected his application months earlier, the words about an unexplained gap in employment history still glowing faintly on the display. Miles closed it without a word, because he had never wanted his daughter to carry his disappointments the way he sometimes carried his late wife's absence. He told her only that his job was honest work, that a paycheck earned by carrying plates was no less dignified than one earned behind a desk, and that no one in this world should ever feel ashamed of how they made their living. Before he left, Miles walked Nora 3 blocks to the home of a close family friend who watched her most evenings while he worked, and along the way he let her talk about a school project on ocean currents, rather than dwelling on the silence that always settled over him whenever old rejections resurfaced. He had once managed daily operations for a respected restaurant group in Chicago, overseeing budgets, staffing, and guest experience with a steady hand that his former colleagues still remembered fondly. When his wife Hannah, who was deaf, fell seriously ill, he had stepped away from that career without hesitation, choosing to care for her rather than chase another promotion, and after she passed 3 years earlier, he had simply never found his way back into the kind of role his experience actually warranted. Every hiring manager who reviewed his resume seemed to fixate on the same gap in dates rather than the years of proven leadership sitting right above it, and Miles had grown weary of explaining a decision he had never once regretted making. At the Aurelia Room, the upscale restaurant where Miles had spent the last 2 years balancing trays and hiding a resume far more accomplished than his position suggested, he did far more than his job required. He caught kitchen tickets before they went out wrong, rearranged tables to shave minutes off wait times, trained new hires who lasted longer because someone finally explained the systems clearly, tracked which dishes were quietly bleeding the restaurant money, and noticed patterns that the people paid to notice them somehow never did. Months earlier, he had drafted a full operations proposal and handed it to the owner, Preston Wycliffe, only to watch the man laugh before he had finished the first page, informing Miles that a waiter lecturing an owner about business was the kind of joke that belonged in a sitcom rather than a boardroom. The restaurant, for all its polished tablecloths and expensive lighting, was quietly drowning. Staff hours had been cut without explanation. Vendors were calling more frequently about unpaid invoices, and Preston kept reminding everyone to make a strong impression on what he vaguely called their silent investor. Miles had no idea who that investor was, only that the tension in the building had been rising for weeks like water behind a dam that nobody wanted to admit was cracking. That evening, Brent Halbrook, the floor manager who charmed wealthy guests while treating his own staff like disposable inconveniences, announced that a special reservation had come in under the name E. Black. He read the accompanying notes aloud with visible irritation, complaining that the request for a visual menu and a server familiar with sign language was going to slow down an already difficult shift. Brent had built a habit of skimming tips off shared pools, quietly altering time cards, and blaming servers below him whenever a guest complained, and he treated any request that deviated from his routine as a personal inconvenience rather than a professional obligation. Miles said nothing at first, filing the note away, the same way he filed away every small warning sign in that building, because experience had taught him that trouble in a restaurant rarely announced itself loudly before it arrived. He had learned American Sign Language years earlier, not as a skill to display, but as the primary language of his household, the language he had shared with his late wife Hannah and now shared with his daughter without ever thinking of it as remarkable. What he did not yet know was that within a few hours, that quiet skill would collide head-on with the arrogance of a management team that had never once considered what it meant to serve someone the world too often overlooked. Evelyn Blackthorne arrived alone that evening, dressed with quiet elegance rather than obvious wealth, carrying none of the visible trappings people expected from the chief executive of a hospitality and capital firm worth billions of dollars. Her interpreter had been called away for a family emergency earlier that afternoon, and rather than reschedule, Evelyn had decided to keep the reservation anyway, curious to see exactly how a restaurant would treat a deaf guest with no intermediary standing between her and the staff. The reservation system carried explicit notes requesting direct communication through writing or visuals, a request that no one speak through a companion who was not present, and a warning that staff should never approach her from behind without first announcing themselves. Brent barely glanced at those instructions before deciding, based on nothing more than her silence when he greeted her, that she was simply being difficult on purpose. Rather than seating her at the reserved table near the window, he led her to a cramped spot beside the swinging kitchen doors, reasoning to himself that a guest who could not hear would never notice she had been dismissed. Evelyn noticed everything. She tracked the minutes that passed without water, the tone in which staff spoke to one another about her, the visible discomfort radiating off every person who approached her table as though she were a problem to be managed rather than a woman to be served. Brent kept raising his voice as though volume alone might somehow restore her hearing, and when she gestured for a pen to communicate in writing, he turned instead to a nearby server and asked, within Evelyn's direct line of sight, whether someone was supposed to be looking after her. From across the dining room, Miles caught sight of the exchange and recognized, immediately and without hesitation, the shapes of the sign language Evelyn had used earlier to greet the host. He understood at once that this was not a woman who needed to be handled or pitied. She needed, simply, someone willing to speak with her the way anyone else in that room would have been spoken to, and he crossed the floor toward her table before he had fully decided to do it. Evelyn's surprise was immediate and unguarded when Miles signed a natural greeting and asked whether she would prefer to stay where she was or move to the table originally reserved in her name. She answered without hesitation, telling him plainly that she wanted to be served the way any other guest in the restaurant would be served, nothing more and nothing less. Miles requested permission to move her, then walked her personally to the window table, explaining each dish on the menu through sign rather than exaggerated gestures, refusing to slow his pace to a condescending crawl, or touch her arm unnecessarily to draw her attention the way so many people mistakenly believed was appropriate. He treated her, in short, like an adult capable of making her own decisions, a small courtesy that had apparently been rare enough in her life to register as remarkable. Tessa Vaughn, A fellow server working the same shift asked Miles half-jokingly since when he knew how to wave his hands around like that, and Brent, overhearing, seized on the remark and repeated it loudly enough for the rest of the floor staff to hear. Laughter rippled through the service station near the bar. Someone suggested Miles was performing for a bigger tip. Another server accused him of trying to impress a wealthy woman, and Brent himself sneered that Miles should focus on carrying plates instead of playing interpreter for guests who had not asked for one. A junior server mimicked a few meaningless hand motions to more laughter, and Miles turned to the group and told them plainly to stop, that mocking a guest's language in front of her, even if she could not hear the joke, was an insult she could see just as clearly as if she had heard every word. Evelyn watched the entire exchange unfold through body language, expression, and the reactions rippling across the room, and though she could not hear the jokes being made at her expense, she understood with complete clarity that she had become the evening's entertainment. Miles continued serving her with total professionalism regardless, and as their conversation deepened over the course of the meal, Evelyn began noticing something she had not expected from a man in his position: a genuine, granular understanding of the restaurant's menu, its ingredient costs, and the friction points between the kitchen and the floor. When she asked why a simple appetizer had taken nearly 30 minutes to arrive, Miles gave her a real answer instead of a scripted apology, explaining that the order system had been misconfigured in a way that sent identical tickets to 2 separate stations, creating chaos that had nothing to do with the kitchen staff's competence. Brent overheard this exchange and felt something closer to fury than embarrassment, furious that Miles was, in his mind, airing the restaurant's dirty laundry directly to a paying customer. Brent snatched the reservation book out of Miles's hands and ordered him, in front of Evelyn and half the dining room, to stop waving his hands at the guest if he still wanted to keep his job. Miles refused to stop communicating with her, stating calmly that a restaurant had no right to demand a guest abandon her own language simply because it made a manager uncomfortable. Evelyn signed clearly that Miles had done nothing to upset her, but because Brent could not read sign language, he turned instead to Tessa and claimed the guest was becoming more agitated by the second. Miles translated Evelyn's words accurately, and Brent, unable to verify anything for himself, accused Miles of twisting her meaning since no one else in the room could confirm what she had actually said. It was at that precise moment that Preston Wycliffe stepped onto the floor, already anxious about the arrival of his mysterious silent investor, and the sight of visible disorder in his dining room sent him into an immediate rage. Brent wasted no time assigning blame, claiming Miles had commandeered a guest's table without authorization, disrupted the rest of the staff, pretended to be a qualified interpreter, criticized the restaurant's internal systems, and made a wealthy patron feel scrutinized and uncomfortable. Preston never once turned to ask Evelyn what had actually happened. Instead, he looked directly at Miles and reminded him, coldly, that this was the same employee whose operations proposal he had dismissed months earlier without reading past the first page. In front of the entire dining room, Preston mocked the idea that a man with real talent would still be carrying plates at 41 years old, then ordered Miles to remove his apron and leave the service floor immediately. Evelyn rose from her seat, prepared to reveal exactly who she was and end the humiliation with a single sentence. But Miles gently signed to her not to bother, that he did not need her to rescue him with her status. He asked only that she not let this one evening convince her that everyone in that building was the same. It was a small sentence, quietly delivered, and it struck Evelyn harder than any display of competence could have. As Miles turned to walk away, she signed a short, urgent request that stopped him mid-step. "Please stay 10 more minutes," she told him, because this was not over yet. Preston was still ordering Miles toward the exit when the front doors opened, and Audrey Finch walked in, flanked by two members of Blackthorn Hospitality's acquisitions team, carrying the final documents needed to close a deal that had been months in the making. Audrey had come to collect signatures, not to referee a scene, but the moment she spotted Evelyn standing near the swinging kitchen doors, she crossed the room immediately and greeted her in sign language with the familiarity of someone who had worked alongside her for years. Preston's face drained of color as he realized the woman he had just watched his staff humiliate at a table beside the kitchen was Evelyn Blackthorn herself, the very investor he had spent weeks anxiously preparing to impress. The mood in the dining room shifted instantly and completely. Brent stopped laughing. Preston began apologizing in a rush of words that came out faster than they made sense. The servers who had joined in mocking Miles suddenly found reasons to avoid looking anywhere near Evelyn's table, and Tessa realized, with a sinking feeling, that they had been observed and evaluated the entire evening without any of them knowing it. Preston tried to salvage the situation by claiming the restaurant was simply short-staffed that night, and that Miles had been the one causing the disruption, adding that Evelyn had likely misunderstood the argument since she could not have heard the full context of what was said. Audrey translated his excuse for Evelyn, and the attempt to weaponize her deafness against her own perception of events only made the situation considerably worse. Evelyn did not raise her voice, because she had never needed to. Instead, she requested the reservation records for the evening, the dining room's security footage, the breakdown of shared tips, any staff complaints filed in recent months, the operations proposal Miles had submitted, and a full accounting of any undisclosed debts tied to the restaurant. Preston insisted none of that had anything to do with tonight's incident, but Audrey reminded him, evenly, that all of it fell squarely under the due diligence clause written into the acquisition agreement he had already signed. Miles stood near the entrance, still not entirely certain what was unfolding in front of him until Evelyn signed that she was in the process of acquiring the restaurant but had not yet decided who would run it. Preston, sensing his leverage slipping away, warned that without him at the helm, Evelyn would end up owning nothing but a beautiful dining room buried under millions of dollars in debt. Evelyn's response was calm and final. That might well be true, but keeping a manager who had already lied to her tonight would cost far more than starting over from nothing. While Audrey searched Preston's office for the acquisition file, she found something unexpected sitting in the bottom drawer of his desk, still sealed and clearly never opened. It was the operations proposal Miles had submitted months earlier, the very document Preston claimed to have read and dismissed on its merits. Its untouched seal told a different story than the one Preston had been telling for months. Evelyn invited Miles into a private office at the back of the restaurant, making no promises about employment or compensation, asking instead that he simply walk her through the proposal he had written. Miles laid out the restaurant's problems with the same calm clarity he had used all evening, beginning with a menu bloated by too many specialty ingredients that drove up inventory costs unnecessarily. He pointed to a ticketing system that had been configured incorrectly for months, creating the exact delay that had frustrated her earlier meal. He described how Brent assigned shifts based on personal favoritism rather than actual customer volume, how tip distribution had grown quietly opaque, and how Preston had cut ingredient quality while continuing to charge full menu prices. He noted that the restaurant routinely failed guests who were deaf, elderly, or otherwise navigating the world differently, and that talented staff kept leaving because there was no visible path forward for anyone willing to stay and work hard. Evelyn asked, plainly, why a man with this level of insight was still working the floor instead of running an entire restaurant group somewhere else. Miles answered honestly, briefly explaining that his late wife Hannah had been deaf, that he had left a promising career to care for her through her illness, and that after her death he had raised their daughter largely alone while hiring managers looked past his experience and fixated instead on the gap in his resume. He did not lean on his family's story for sympathy, admitting instead that he had let his own confidence erode over time and had stayed in a position beneath his ability for far longer than he probably should have. Audrey checked his employment history and confirmed that Miles had once helped turn around a struggling restaurant in Chicago, increasing its revenue significantly before he stepped away to care for his family. Tobias Crane, the head chef who had grown quietly disillusioned with Preston's leadership, was called into the room and confirmed without hesitation that Miles had repeatedly caught operational failures and offered practical solutions long before that night. Preston protested loudly, accusing the room of conspiring to steal his restaurant out from under him. Audrey calmly reminded him that the business had already violated the terms of its loan agreement, that he had concealed unpaid debts from vendors for months, that he had personally signed the conditional sale agreement now sitting in her folder, that Blackthorn Capital held every legal right to complete the acquisition, and that firing a staff member in the middle of an active due diligence review violated the anti-retaliation clause built directly into that same contract. Evelyn signed the final documents on the spot, formally completing the acquisition of the Aurelia Room. Rather than handing Miles a title immediately, however, she placed a different kind of offer on the table in front of him, one that came with conditions attached rather than a gift freely given. She proposed that Miles be given 90 days to prove that a waiter's plan could genuinely save a restaurant worth millions of dollars. Evelyn appointed Miles interim operating director for a trial period of 90 days, and the agreement Audrey drew up left nothing to chance or sentiment. Miles would receive a fair management salary and full authority over daily operations, reporting directly to Evelyn and Audrey, rather than through any remaining layer of Preston's old hierarchy. If he hit specific targets tied to profit, staff retention, and guest satisfaction, he would earn the right to purchase 12% ownership at a discounted price. If he failed, Blackthorn would simply bring in an outside management team and move forward without him. Nothing about the arrangement was handed to him freely, and Miles understood clearly that he would have to earn every inch of it. Preston was stripped of operating authority but retained a small remaining stake in the business, pending the outcome of a formal audit. Brent was suspended while the investigation proceeded, though he could not resist one final jab, telling anyone who would listen that Miles had only been chosen because Evelyn felt grateful to the man who had talked to her with his hands. Miles did not dignify the jab with a response, asking instead that every tip record and time card in the building be preserved untouched for review. On his first day as director, he did not claim Preston's office as his own trophy. Instead, he went straight down to the kitchen, washed his hands, and began taking inventory alongside Tobias, exactly as he had done unofficially for years. Not everyone welcomed the change. Some staff still saw Miles as a co-worker who had simply gotten lucky, and a few worried openly that he would use his new authority to punish anyone who had laughed along with Brent. Tessa feared she might be fired outright. Mid-level supervisors worried about losing whatever small privileges they had accumulated under the old system. Miles addressed the tension directly, announcing that no one would be punished simply for laughing nervously at a manager's cruelty, but that anyone caught continuing to defraud the restaurant or disrespect a guest going forward would face real consequences without exception. He began making changes almost immediately, publishing the tip distribution process for everyone to see, trimming the bloated menu down to something sustainable, rebuilding the shift schedule around actual demand, creating a reservation system that was genuinely accessible, training staff in basic sign language for communicating with deaf guests, and opening a direct channel for employees to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Revenue did not improve overnight, and the first week under the new system felt more chaotic than before, simply because decades of bad habits were being dismantled all at once. While reviewing the restaurant's financial records more closely, Miles discovered that the missing funds ran far deeper than anyone had initially suspected, and that a portion of that missing money had been quietly funneled into a shell company with clear ties to Preston himself. Preston understood exactly what a completed audit would mean for him: the loss of his remaining shares and very likely a lawsuit waiting on the other side of it. Rather than accept that outcome, he reached out secretly to Brent, and together they began working to ensure Miles failed before his 90 days ever ran their course. Their tactics were quiet and difficult to trace at first. They canceled food deliveries with a single phone call, convinced longtime staff to quit without warning, spread rumors that Blackthorn intended to shut the restaurant down entirely, posted fabricated negative reviews online, told loyal regulars that Miles had lowered the restaurant's standards, and leaked the story that Evelyn had handed control of a landmark restaurant to a former waiter. Preston made a point of visiting old vendor contacts personally, buying them drinks and reminding them of decades of loyalty, hinting that Blackthorn Hospitality would eventually strip the restaurant for parts and leave every one of them unpaid, regardless of who was currently running the kitchen. Brent, meanwhile, quietly encouraged two experienced servers to walk out mid-shift during one of the restaurant's busiest weekends, timing their departure to cause maximum disruption right as Miles was rebuilding the schedule from the ground up. Neither man showed his face directly during these efforts, preferring instead to work through favors, old friendships, and the kind of quiet influence that rarely left fingerprints anyone could point to in a formal complaint. A local news outlet eventually picked up the story, running a mocking headline suggesting that Blackthorn Hospitality had handed a restaurant to a man who simply knew a few hand gestures. The article put real pressure on Evelyn from her own investment board, with several members suggesting she had let a personal encounter cloud a purely business decision. Evelyn told Miles directly that she would not shield him by hiding the numbers, and that if the restaurant kept losing money, she would still have to replace him regardless of how the story had begun. Miles accepted that condition without complaint, telling her plainly that he had no interest in being treated as a charity case rather than a capable operator. In the middle of that pressure, Tessa finally admitted that Brent had once forced staff to sign falsified tip sheets, and that she still had photographs of several of the older, doctored records saved on her phone. Tobias, meanwhile, discovered that every vendor who had abruptly canceled deliveries had received a call from a phone number tied directly to Preston's private office. Miles had more than enough reason to expose everything publicly right away, but he chose instead to gather additional evidence first, wary that Preston would simply dismiss it all as the resentful accusations of one disgruntled employee. Evelyn noticed that Miles never acted out of anger, that every decision he made seemed weighed first against its impact on the people working under him rather than his own vindication. Somewhere in those difficult weeks, the respect growing between Evelyn and Miles quietly deepened into something closer and more personal. The two of them often stayed late after closing, talking without an interpreter present, communicating entirely through the shared language that had first connected them on that chaotic opening night. It was during one of those late conversations that Miles uncovered something even more urgent than the missing funds. Preston had personally guaranteed the restaurant's lease against a private loan, a debt that could cost Blackthorn the entire building if it was not resolved before the end of the week. That personal guarantee meant the bank now had the legal right to reclaim the restaurant's lease, unless the emergency debt was settled immediately. Several members of Evelyn's investment board suggested she simply cut her losses and abandon the Aurelia room entirely, redirecting her attention toward more stable assets elsewhere in her portfolio. Evelyn certainly had enough capital to pay off the debt outright without blinking, but Miles pushed back against the idea of simply burying every past mistake under a mountain of cash. Instead, he proposed a three-part plan. Negotiate directly with the building's landlord to separate the lease from Preston's personal guarantee, host a single high-profile night designed to prove the restaurant could still generate meaningful revenue, and use the fraud evidence they had already gathered to force the shell company to return the stolen funds. The showcase night was built around a simple idea Miles called a table without barriers. The menu was redesigned to be fully visual and easy to navigate. Staff received basic training in sign language for greeting and assisting guests. A discreet lighting system replaced audible call bells for service requests. No guest with a disability was turned into a marketing prop or a talking point. Every guest, regardless of how they communicated, would simply be served the way they wanted to be served. Evelyn worried privately that the event might end up exploiting her own condition for publicity, and Miles agreed immediately that her name and personal story would never appear anywhere in the promotion. In the days leading up to the event, Miles personally walked every server through the new visual menu system, testing their comfort with basic greetings and simple phrases until even the most hesitant among them could welcome a deaf guest without freezing or panicking. He asked Tobias to simplify the kitchen's busiest dishes so that a smaller, more focused staff could execute them flawlessly under pressure, reasoning that a shorter menu done perfectly would always beat a long one executed poorly. Evelyn offered to fund additional marketing, but Miles declined, insisting the restaurant needed to prove it could succeed on the strength of its own reputation rather than a wave of paid promotion, and that a smaller, honest crowd would tell them more than a manufactured one ever could. The event drew a strong crowd, boosted by genuine word of mouth rather than manufactured buzz, and early reviews from the community were overwhelmingly positive. Just before doors opened, however, Brent sabotaged the reservation system, causing dozens of guests to arrive expecting the exact same seating time. Miles refused to cancel the event. He split the dining room into manageable sections, coordinated closely with Tobias in the kitchen, and personally stood near the entrance explaining the situation to arriving guests with calm, unhurried honesty. Evelyn arrived to observe, but deliberately chose not to intervene, wanting to see whether Miles could truly lead a room without her authority standing visibly behind him. By the end of the night, the restaurant had recorded its highest revenue in 11 months. Security footage later confirmed that Brent had accessed the reservation system using an old management login moments before the reservations collapsed into chaos. Audrey called an emergency meeting bringing together staff, investors, and legal representatives to settle the matter once and for all. Preston showed up hoping to use the reservation disaster as proof that Miles had lost control of the operation, demanding the board cancel the 90-day agreement and restore his authority immediately. Miles did not argue with emotion. Instead, he laid out the evidence point by point. Security footage proving Brent had accessed the system without authorization. Phone records showing Preston pressuring vendors into canceling deliveries, tip records revealing tens of thousands of dollars withheld from staff, a shell company receiving restaurant funds at an address tied directly to Preston's family office, a lease guarantee signed without informing the buyer, fabricated online reviews traced back to accounts connected to Brent, and financial results showing the new operating plan was already turning a genuine profit. Brent tried to shift every bit of blame onto Preston, while Preston insisted Brent had acted entirely on his own without his knowledge or approval. Tessa stood and confirmed, without hesitation, that the two men had been coordinating together for months. Tobias and several other staff members offered corroborating statements of their own. Evelyn then delivered her decisions plainly and without theatrics. Brent would be terminated immediately for fraud and sabotage. Preston would lose all remaining operating authority. Whatever value remained in his shares would be applied toward damages under the terms of their contract. The full record would be turned over to legal counsel and the appropriate authorities, and every employee whose tips had been stolen would be reimbursed in full. Preston made one final attempt to belittle Miles, sneering that he was still, at his core, nothing more than a waiter a wealthy woman had picked because he made her feel special. Evelyn did not respond to the insult directly. Instead, she asked Miles to present his complete 90-day report to the room. The numbers spoke plainly for themselves. Revenue was up, ingredient costs were down, guest satisfaction had climbed substantially, staff turnover had dropped sharply. The restaurant was profitable again for the first time in over a year, and the emergency debt had already been successfully restructured. Evelyn then placed a new agreement on the table in front of Miles, one that was no longer a temporary trial or a conditional employment contract, but a formal offer of ownership in the restaurant itself. Evelyn announced to the room that Miles had met every single target set for him and had done so well before his 90 days were even complete. She offered him the title of operating partner of the Aurelia Room, a role that would include 12% ownership of the business. The possibility of additional shares tied to 3-year performance goals, full authority over daily operations, a permanent seat on the restaurant's governing board, the chance to build a hiring program specifically designed for candidates with unexplained employment gaps, and the opportunity to help shape accessibility standards across every other property in the Blackthorn Hospitality portfolio. Audrey slid a folder across the table, containing every clause spelled out in plain language, walking Miles through vesting terms, board obligations, and the specific benchmarks he would need to maintain over the coming years to retain his position. She made clear that the offer carried real risk alongside its real reward, that ownership meant shouldering losses just as readily as profits, and that Evelyn had insisted on transparent terms precisely because she never wanted Miles to feel he had been handed something he could not fully understand or defend to anyone who questioned it later. Miles did not sign immediately. He asked Evelyn directly whether she was choosing him because of his ability, or simply because he had been the first person in that building willing to speak with her honestly and directly. Evelyn answered that his fluency in her language was certainly what had opened the door between them that first night, but that it was the way he led, the way he protected the people working under him, and his refusal to exploit the power suddenly placed in his hands that had truly earned him a seat at the table. Miles signed the agreement without hesitation. In front of the entire staff, Evelyn did not introduce him as the man who had helped a deaf executive get through an awkward dinner. She introduced him as the man who had rescued a business that people with far more impressive titles had nearly destroyed through negligence and greed. The same employees who had once laughed at Miles now watched him stand beside Evelyn as an equal partner rather than a server carrying their orders. He did not fire Tessa or the others who had joined in mocking him that first night, offering each of them a place in the new training program instead, though he made clear that silence in the face of open cruelty carried its own quiet cost going forward. Preston walked out through the very same door he had once ordered Miles to leave through, and this time no one applauded or mocked him on his way out. The silence in the room said everything that needed to be said. Brent left through a side entrance minutes later, his employment badge already deactivated, and none of the staff who had once laughed at his jokes bothered to look up from their work as he passed. In the weeks that followed, Miles set up a quiet mentorship program for new hires who carried the same kind of employment gaps hiring managers had once used to dismiss him without a second thought, pairing each of them with a staff member willing to help them settle into steady, dependable work. He made sure every one of those candidates was judged on the strength of an interview rather than the shape of a resume, a small correction to a system that had cost him years of his own career. Tobias began training two younger cooks who reminded him of himself decades earlier, patient in a way he had not always been under Preston's ownership, and the kitchen ran with a rhythm that felt, for the first time in years, genuinely sustainable rather than merely survivable. 6 months later, the Aurelia room was running with steady, dependable profitability. The restaurant had not been reshaped into a novelty catering only to deaf guests, but had instead become a place where every visitor could choose the way they wanted to communicate and be met exactly where they stood. The menu remained fully visual and easy to navigate. A quiet, light-based call system had permanently replaced the old audible service bells. Staff continued learning basic sign language as part of their standard training. New accessibility procedures served a wide range of guest needs. Tip distribution remained fully transparent. Employees had a clear and visible path toward advancement, and job candidates with unexplained gaps in their employment history were no longer automatically dismissed without a second glance. Nora attended the restaurant's anniversary celebration that evening, greeting Evelyn warmly in sign language and immediately noticing that the very first table Evelyn had ever sat at was still standing exactly where it always had been. Miles had never removed that table from service, though he had moved it from its original spot beside the kitchen doors to the best seat in the entire restaurant, overlooking the lit skyline of the city. When Evelyn asked why he had kept it at all, Miles explained that it served as a permanent reminder that the way a business treats the person it considers least important reveals its true character far more honestly than any polished mission statement ever could. After Nora left for the evening with a family friend, Evelyn and Miles sat together at that same table, no longer simply chief executive and operating partner, but two people who had built something genuine between them over months of shared work and shared honesty. Evelyn asked, half teasing, whether Miles ever regretted walking across that dining room toward her table on the night this all began. Miles signed back that his only real regret was not telling Brent to be quiet sooner than he had. She reminded him, gently, that he had spent years believing a single decision to step away from his career had somehow diminished him, when in truth it had simply postponed a chapter that was always waiting to begin once he was ready for it. Miles admitted that some nights he still thought about Hannah while standing at that same window table, imagining what she might have said about the strange, winding path that had brought him here, and Evelyn told him she liked to think Hannah would have approved of exactly where that path had led. Tobias walked past with a tray of desserts destined for a party of regulars celebrating an anniversary of their own, pausing just long enough to nod at the two of them before disappearing back into the kitchen he now ran with far more confidence than he had a year earlier. Tessa, working the floor with the calm assurance of someone who had grown considerably since that first chaotic night, guided a young family with a deaf grandmother to a table near the window, signing a warm greeting before any of them had to ask. Evelyn laughed. Across the room, a new server greeted a deaf guest in sign language, warmly and without hesitation, and no one turned to stare, no one whispered, and no one treated the moment as some kind of performance worth mocking. The story closed with Evelyn resting her hand gently on the partnership agreement, bearing two names side by side, Evelyn Blackthorne and Miles Corbin. The man once ordered out of that dining room no longer merely had a seat at its finest table. He had become one of the people who owned it,